Hi guys, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So one of the things that comes up in a lot of the comments underneath videos that I make concerning the development of the medieval European sword hilt and going into the Renaissance sword is that the medieval sword used by all classes of people basically in the Middle Ages was a crucifix symbol, was a cross. Now, whilst this is in a sense true, I think that there's a notion that is taken largely from modern literature that the cross-hilted sword was almost invented to be a Christian symbol. And I don't think that this is the case at all. First of all, some of the earliest cross-hilted swords that we know about, that we can absolutely definitely date because they're taken from burials, are actually placed with their pagan owners in Scandinavia. So it wouldn't make sense in that sense if the earliest cross-hilted swords we have are from a pagan culture, then, or at least they're equally being used in pagan countries, then it wouldn't make sense that it was a Christian symbol, or at least at that date that it was associated with Christian kind of ideas and ideals. Or perhaps that it was invented as inspired by Christianity. I don't think that that was the case at all. And in actual fact, we see cross-hilted swords in a variety of cultures from around the world. We see them, for example, the Sudanese kaskara, used by the very staunchly Islamist forces under the Mahdi in the 1880s. So very clearly that wasn't a Christian symbol because they were very much Muslims, but they used cross-hilted swords. Equally, you find cross-hilted swords in amongst the Tuareg tribes, also of the more northern Sudan. But there are cross-hilted swords found in all Islamic countries in the Middle Ages, and actually, although there's this perception that in the Crusades, the generic Crusades, which are seen to have happened a bit like the Wild West in this mysterious time separated from the rest of history, very often, in fiction anyway, that somehow the Crusaders all had cross-hilted swords and the Muslim forces all had sort of forms of shamsha or scimitar type weapon. Well, this is actually complete rubbish. In actual fact, certainly at the time of the First Crusade and Second Crusade, and even to a degree by the Third Crusade, many of the Muslim forces actually used straight double-edged blades and had very often types of cross-hilt. They weren't usually as long as the European ones. They usually got shorter, shorter guard, shorter quillons, but nevertheless they are still more or less a cross-shaped sword. And in fact, even if you look at the curved swords, if you look at the Mamluk and Persian kind of curved swords, the sort of the predecessor, the ancestor, as it were, of the later Shamshir, then in actual fact they also have a cross hilt still on them, and you can see a sort of a descendant of these swords in Eastern Europe, even up until the 17th century, where you have a sabre blade with a long cross hilt on it. And really there's no connection, there's no direct connection to religion, other than it was observed, and this is the caveat to my argument, it certainly was observed in certain European sources, and in fact in fencing treatises it is occasionally alluded to, that a sword has a cross symbol in it. It's incidental, and so they note it. They say that, you know, the sword can be used for kind of for Christian purposes, and look, and there's a cross in it. At no point do they ever say in the original sources this was designed this way because that's the shape of the cross, which actually, if you think about it, if a sword is held that way up, it's actually an upside down cross, which is a bit weird. So at no point do they suggest that the sword was designed this way to be like the cross. The sword evolved in various cultures and countries, some Christian, some Muslim, some pre-Christian, you know, pagan religions, so essentially Odinism, developed, and then in the Christian countries they went, oh look, it looks like a cross. Okay, that's a very, very different thing to saying that the sword was like this because of Christianity. I don't think that there's any real evidence to suggest that that's the case. In actual fact, the sword developed like this, and then they went, oh look, it looks like a cross, if you hold it upside down, like that, and then sort of pray with it like this. They always do in Crusader films, they always hold the sword and pray with it. So there we go. I don't think, therefore, that it is invented for Christian reasons at all. I think it's just a development of the earlier kind of the Viking era type sword, which had various styles of a pommel. In fact, this is one style of pommel they had at that time, and the guard, generally speaking, from about the middle of the 10th century in general, but you could even say a bit earlier, there are a couple of representations of quite long crossguards, quite early in fact in the 10th century. Oh, and the other thing to note as well is that very often these crossguards on the simple hilted cruciform medieval swords are curved. Well, if they were that worried about making it look like a crucifix, they wouldn't curve the guard, would they? They'd keep it straight, because clearly having a curved guard, no, it doesn't really look so much like a cross anymore, so they wouldn't do that. And very clearly many medieval swords have curved guards, some of them really curved. And funnily enough, actually, while I think about it, I can think of two swords, one in Spain and one in Poland, that have exceptionally curved guards, and both of them are covered in Christian Latin writings. So that wouldn't make sense at all. They're like ultimate Christian swords in two very Catholic countries, Spain and Poland, and they've got very curved guards. So the idea that the sword is intrinsically connected with the crucifix, just it doesn't work for me at all. It doesn't work historically, and doesn't work in terms of actually what it looks like. And of course the fact that it was used in these non-Christian countries. The final thing I would say is some people have suggested that when I talked about the development of sword hilts and the fact that you start to get finger rings and knuckle bows first, and then you get side rings, and it develops into the side sword hilt or the rapier hilt that we see in the 16th and then the 17th centuries. Some people have suggested that maybe the development of that protection was held back by Christianity, that they wanted to keep the purity of the cross symbol. And again, that just doesn't really work for me, because you've got forms of sword hilt which don't look at all like a cross, because you've got either curved guards, or you don't have a very long cross guard, for example, on some types of messer, Langsmesser that is, or certain types of falchion, and quite early on, from the sort of 13th, 14th century, and then into the 16th and 17th centuries, well, that's actually the period where there were massive religious wars in Europe. The development of Protestantism in the 16th century, and the Reformation in England and the 30 Years' War, and there was huge upheaval in Europe because of the division between Catholic and Protestant. And at that time, you think if this was so important a religious symbol to them, do you think they would go away from that? So the period in which the most development in the hilt was happening was almost you could say the period when there was perhaps the biggest degree of religious upheaval and fervour within Europe. So no, it just doesn't work for me. I just don't think, although some medieval sources and certainly lots of modern fictitious fiction sources point out that this is superficially like a crucifix, and it could possibly be used for praying purposes, and it could be used in the symbolically in knighting and so on as a crucifix. Fundamentally, it's a sword. Okay, this crossguard developed for practical reasons because it protects your hand from all sorts of things. Protects your hand from other swords, obviously running down there and stopping on it. But equally, it stops your hand from bashing into things. If you're fighting in a shield wall, for example, your hand is not going to get mashed up on someone else's shield, because, there we go, that's a straight line between two things, it doesn't touch my hand. So it is a fairly simple but effective form of handguard for a sword, and that's why it developed. It was only incidental that they noticed it had religious connotations or use that they could put it to. But very important to remember that in Islamic countries and many other religioned countries, in India, in Hinduism and so on, you find cross-hilted swords also. There we go, guys. Cheers!